So I'm going to talk a little bit now about how as a jazz pianist we might encounter a lead sheet, sometimes known as a top line and chords, in the context of a jazz piano trio or a small band setting, and the kind of ways we might interpret that and use it. The standard we're going to use as an example is Autumn Leaves, a classic standard by Johnny Mercer. It's the kind of thing that is assumed to be jazz core repertoire. So if you were in a session and in the same way as you'd be expected to know your way around a 12-bar blues or rhythm changes, this tune, Autumn Leaves, is just one of those that it's just assumed that a competent jazz musician will know. So it's a good thing to learn anyway. We're going to talk a little bit about what a lead sheet is, what to expect from it, and what it kind of looks like. We're going to talk about the sort of pianistic approach we might use to assembling that. I'll talk a little bit more about harmony and the sort of left-hand voicings we might use. They sort of link together really. And then we'll talk a little bit about the ensemble considerations, the way you're going to work with your rhythm section and the way you might consider putting an arrangement together. Okay, let's go. So the lead sheet itself is designed to be a vanilla flavoured version of this tune. As you can see, there's nearly no information there at all. There's no written out parts, there's nothing to thicken the melody line, there's no written out left hand at all, there's no arrangement, there's no figures. It's the simplest possible iteration of this particular piece of music. So we've got a simple melody line and we've got the harmonic structure over the top in the form of chord symbols. Now obviously the whole point of this is to give us an awful lot of freedom. What this does is make space for us to interpret, to improvise, to put our own personality, our own stamp, our own take on the way we play this piece. So that's the big advantage. We could play it differently every time we meet it if we choose to, using this sort of blueprint as our starting point. In a band situation, everybody's going to be looking at the same thing. The vocalist, the horn players, you the pianist, the rhythm section, everybody's going to be looking at the same basic piece of information, so we all have the same sort of starting point for what it is that we're doing, and that can be an advantage. Obviously the downside of all this is that you've got to know the etiquette, you've got to know the strategies, you've got to know basically what to do with it now you've got it. So there are definite pros and cons, but I think on the whole the pros outweigh the cons. So looking at this particular lead sheet, one of the things you might notice straight away is that the rhythms are extremely straight. Again, this is about giving you space and room to manoeuvre. Nobody in the right mind would expect you to play these rhythms exactly as they look. It would be exceedingly boring. If I simply play the first couple of phrases exactly as they look, and I think we can all agree that's not ever so exciting. So the assumption is that you will pull, push, make the rhythms do interesting things, maybe add the odd embellishment. So you might end up with something like this. Favourite, by the way, is to anticipate the beginning of those 3 quartet pickups. Etc, etc. And obviously there's an infinite number of options there. And that's true for the entire lead sheet. So feel free to experiment, try things out, try pulling, pushing, phrasing things in different ways to find your own personal route through this thing. And maybe, as I say, you can make it differently every time you play it. That's part of the fun of this. Let's think about a pianistic approach for a moment. I've talked before about the way music in a very simplistic way has 3 layers. There's a top line of melody that's a single horizontal line of pitches. There's a bottom line of bass, which is another horizontal line of pitches that anchors the harmony, and in the middle is a wider strata where the harmony lives, the different sort of colours that adds. That's a very simplistic way to view it, but it's an interesting starting point and helps you get a lever on how you might decide how to play a thing. If we were playing a completely solo version of a piece, we somehow need to cover all those 3 bases ourselves, and that's fairly tricky because we've got to share out those 3 layers of information between our 2 hands. If we are playing to accompany a vocalist perhaps, we might be playing the bottom deck and the chords in the middle. Because the vocalist, or maybe a solo lead line player, a trumpeter or a sax player or something, maybe they're playing the melody, so you're looking after the bottom 2/3, as it were. In a small band or a piano trio setting though, very often we've got a bass player who's looking after the bottom end of things. So our responsibility is to deal with the top 2/3, so the harmony is going to wind up in our left hand, and the melody obviously in our right. And this leads to this style of playing sometimes known as a kind of trumpet right hand, where the right hand is simply playing a single note melody. It's not worrying about any harmonic extras, although actually in reality pianists do embellish and thicken the line there, but really it's a single line melody to all intents and purposes. And the left hand will be dealing with the voicings. Let's talk now about what some of those voicings might look like. Obviously, when you first encounter a standard, the first thing you need to know is, do I know all these chords? And without labouring the point too much, the first place to start is, have you got your majors and minors sorted out? Because if those foundational triads aren't correct, the harmony is never going to work anyway. So first thing to say is, be sure that major and minor is clear in your mind and you know where these all are. In most standards, I know there are always difficult exceptions, but in most standards there's a relatively limited vocabulary of chords. So with a bit of care you can quite quickly work out what the set of chords are that are needed for a given piece. So it shouldn't take a year and a day to work that one out. So if you're uncertain about any of them, figure them out, write them down, that will help you internalise them, and that's a good starting place. But as we know in jazz, the minimum really is 4 voices for most chords, because we're expecting a richer, more interesting sound than simply the triads. So next port of call is, what's going on with the extras? Well, in this particular piece, as you can see, there are a number of minor sevenths. So we've got a minor triad, I'll take the A minor as an example, and the seventh itself is a minor seventh interval from the root. We can always check that out by seeing the distance between that seventh and the octave of the root. And we can see that that's a whole tone away, so we know we've spelt that chord correctly. That typically cool, neutral sort of minor seventh sound. And of course, the sound of the chords is a really good indicator as to whether you got the spelling right, because if you made a mistake and played something wrong, it'll sound like a different type of chord. So try and associate those sort of colours or flavours, or however you want to perceive it, but the way the chords actually sound. A minor seventh will always have this quality. So if it suddenly sounds more spiky or more strange than that, chances are one of the voices has got messed up somewhere along the line and you need to go back and recheck your spelling. So we've got A minor 7. In terms of minor voicings, there's a couple of other interesting ones in there. In bar 8 we've got an E minor 6. Now, weirdly, a minor 6th chord, the 6th itself is always raised, so it's always a whole tone above the 5th. Very mysterious sounding chord, I always think. Touch of James Bond. Especially if you add a 9th as well. Okay, but it's important to remember that 6th chord is quite exotic sounding. Maybe it's a bit more out there than you would like it to sound, and because that's only a decoration on the minor chord, if you were to swap that out for another minor 7, say, if you want something a bit more sort of calm and cool and not quite so exotic sounding, switching the E minor 6 for an E minor 7 is not going to wreck anything. And certainly in a piano trio setting, there's only you worrying about the harmony. So your bass player really won't be too badly affected by that. If you're playing with another harmonic player, like a guitarist, then perhaps you need to have a conversation and decide which way you're going to go with it. But in this setting, you can make up your own mind. So if you like that very rich E minor 6 sound, stick with it. If not, if you want something a bit more, as I say, cool, go for the 7th sound. And that's fair game. The last species of minor chord on this sheet is a bit of an exotic sounding one. Take a look at bar 6. And you can see we've got a thing there that looks horrific. The chord symbol looks dreadful, doesn't it? But the good news is, it does exactly what it says on the can. This is a minor 7 flat 5 chord, and it does just what it says it's going to do. So we're going to grab an F sharp minor, so spell that F sharp A C sharp. We're going to add the 7th, which is an E, and then we're going to flatten the 5th. Now remember, flattening is a process, not necessarily accidental. So when we say flatten, we really mean lower, don't we? So the 5th in this instance is a C sharp. So by flattening it or lowering it, we make C sharp into C natural. So here we go. We've got an F sharp minor 7 with a flattened 5th. There's the minor, there's the 7th, drop the 5th, and we've got this sound. It's almost a diminished sound, isn't it? It's really quite crunchy, quite dissonant. It's a great setup chord for what's coming next, which is the B7. Okay. And of course you can hear that's leading towards a minor chord to finish the cadence. So the F sharp chord becomes a 2, the B7 is 5, and the E minor 6 is 1. So that's our minor chords. The major chords are reasonably straightforward in this. I don't think there are any added 6th chords anywhere, so all we've got to think about is major 7s and dominant 7s. Remember that a dominant 7, because it's so common, doesn't have a special fancy chord symbol. If it just says 7, it means dominant 7. So remember, that's a major triad. Let's take the D7 in bar 2 as an example there. I don't mean bar 2, I mean bar 3, don't I? We've got a major triad. The 7th is a minor 7th interval. There's that whole tone relationship with the octave again. So we've got a major triad but a minor 7th, and the result is this edgy dominant 7th sound. It sounds kind of restless because it's pointing somewhere else. Contrast that for a moment with the next bar along, which is a G major 7. So here we've got the major triad, of course, at the bottom, but the 7th now is a major 7th interval as well, so it's a semitone away from its octave. So F sharp, so our chord now sounds like this. That's a very different creature, isn't it? If I play a G dominant 7 first, compare with G major 7, what a massively different sound that is, isn't it? Just from moving that 7th, a semitone either way. Okay, so those really are our two types of major chord in this piece. The last thing I want to draw your attention to is what's happening in the second system from the end, in the last couple of bars there, and you can see there's sort of 2 layers of harmony there. Very often in jazz versions of pieces, bear in mind that these standards, as they're called, come from different places. Sometimes they're composed by a jazz musician for a band, but very often they were pinched from being a popular song of the day, in the 30s and 40s perhaps, or from a Broadway musical. And then the jazzers did their own things. They lopped off the verse and threw that away and kept the chorus, and then maybe they messed around with the harmonies a bit to make them a bit more suitable for improvising. So in this case, the bottom layer is probably the one that's a little bit nearer to the original song, I would suspect. And what you're looking at there is, oh yeah, a different kind of chord coming up. E minor first. The second chord along is a G augmented, that's where we sharpen the 5th. So the D becomes D sharp. But as you can see from that slash symbol, it's a G chord, G augmented slash D sharp. In other words, the D sharp is in the bass. Now of course, if we've got a bass player, and we do in this situation, we don't necessarily have to worry about the D sharp being on the bottom of the harmony, because they're going to do that. So as long as we've got a D sharp and not a D natural, we'll be okay. That's okay. Next chord is a G. Next chord is another one of those minor 7 flat 5s. It's a C sharp minor 7 flat 5. So the spelling is C sharp, E, G, B. As I say, you don't have to voice these with the root note on the bottom. The bass player will do that for us. But in a case like this, it's sometimes quite good because it helps you stay on track with where the harmony's going. And you can see that when you go around the corner onto the final system by 30 there, you're heading for a C chord. So actually, and then of course into the next bar to B. So there's a lovely chromatic downward walk going on there, and actually having that on the bottom, as I say, it's not mandatory, but I think it helps you stay on track. And you can hear the harmony kind of oozing downhill. You'll have heard that in lots of other pieces, I'm sure. It's a fairly common device. However, in this particular version, we've also got an alternative above in brackets. And if you take a look at those, you can see that the spelling is a little different now, but that chromatic bass line is still the same. This time it's shown as E, E flat, D, D flat before the C. And the chords themselves end up sounding a bit more exotic. This is what this sounds like. This is the upper version. Okay, I'll play that again. So that's a typical jazz player's edition. It makes them a bit more juicy and a bit more interesting. But there is a little caveat. You'll notice that on the E flat 7 chord, which has B flat in it, at that same moment in the melody you'll be playing B natural, which may not be a good thing. So you might want to save the more exotic version for maybe when you're doing the improvisation. So make sure you told your bass player what you're doing just so they know, but fundamentally that's a good way to make use of those exotic chords but without getting yourself into trouble on the version when you're actually going to play the melody. Okay. This is quite a big topic, the harmony, isn't it? So I'm going to talk next about voicings. Now we know how to spell the chords and how to find them, let's talk about the voicings themselves. What we're aiming to achieve here is for the voicings not to get too low. If I just demonstrate this, if I take some versions of a C chord, clearly as I get lower down it gets less and less comfortable of a sound. Those close voicings low down are really quite muddy and murky. They're not going to sound great and they're going to start to get in the way of the bass player. So our left hand really doesn't want to be much below the C, below middle C. And even that, in some cases, might be pushing it a little bit. I feel happiest in this context when my left-hand voicings are round about that area, bordering on middle C and the area just around about it, that sort of octave, if you like, between the F below and above middle C. That's the kind of territory I'm looking towards. And if it bleeds a little bit lower, okay, that'll be fine, but we certainly don't want to be down here somewhere, down at the bottom of the bass clef. That's not going to help. So that sort of area. That's the first thing to say. So that's the sort of region we're going to inhabit. Linking voicings is really important. It's important for the point of view of consistency of sound, because if I do this, you can hear that's playing all those chords in root position voicings, and apart from being clumsy, I've got to move an awful lot to find them all. It doesn't sound great either because the consistency is not very smooth. It's sort of musical Tetris. You've got a block of this and a block of that and a block of something else, and it sounds a little bit clumsy. So ideally we want to pick a chain of inversions that let us put some of those chords together. So I might play my A-7 chord in root position, but then play the D7 by simply moving the top two voices down. Notice that A-7 and D7 share two common voices. The A and the C are in both chords, so I can use those as sort of pivots. Now then, let's carry on this chain. I'm going to go to G major 7 next. I've already got a D and an F sharp present, so if I simply bump the bottom two voices down, I can play G major 7th. Looking ahead next, I've already got a G and a B at the bottom, which will do for my C major 7, so this time I'll bump the top two voices down. That gives me C major 7. I can do the same thing again with the bottom two now. That gives me my F minor 7 flat 5, and then B7 again. So I actually got this great chain of voicings that involves very little physical work and also links nicely. And then maybe finish there on the E minor 6. So at first, you're probably going to plan your route. You're going to work out which connections work well and how you're going to get through those voicings. With experience, you'll need to plan less because you'll just kind of know where you're heading. But at the beginning, figure out where you're going to go. Take some time and work out the best voicings and the best connections of voicings to get a little chain of left-hand shapes that will get you through the piece satisfactorily. When we come to fit left and right hand together, we could just play slabs of chord. But it wouldn't be ever so exciting again. So what we probably want to do is to use the left hand as a kind of punctuation mark. So as we said earlier on, we'll phrase the right hand in a creative, interesting way, and we'll leave lots of air between the left hand voicings, so they become little punctuation marks that either reinforce or dot in between what the right hand does. There's one important thing you need to know about autumn leaves though, and this is one of these conventions that you somehow expected to magically know, so I'm telling you now. Autumn leaves conventionally is played with the lead line instrument, vocalist, trumpeter, in this case your right hand, starting the phrase in the first 16 bars, and the rhythm section or the harmonic information doing stop chords. So it sounds like this. And that'll continue for the next 8 bars. When you get halfway through the tune, when you get to bar 18 there, then the tempo will kick in, the drums and the bass will start playing in time rather than doing stops, and you're comping what you're doing with your left hand. Can also free up and be wherever it needs to be. As I say, think of those left hand stabs as punctuation marks to the melody. That's also true when you come to improvise as well. This isn't something to pre-plan. The more you think about it, the worse it'll get. Just slot them in wherever it feels intuitive and comfortable to do so. And you will find that when you start playing with your rhythm section, you need to work much less hard than you expect. They're going to carry you on this lovely wave of momentum and rhythm. So you don't have to work anywhere near as hard with that left hand as you think you might do. So less is definitely more. Let's talk finally about the ensemble. We've talked about the stop chords at the beginning. That's not true for very many standards, but there are certain tunes that just always get played the same way, and this is a very distinctive example, so it's good to know that. When the improvisation comes round, those stop chords won't happen. The tempo will just carry on through the changes as it normally would. Incidentally, I also should have said that if you find right hand colliding with left hand, if they're occupying the same space too much, rather than push your left hand voicings too far down so they start to get muddy and murky, it's perfectly okay to put your right hand up an octave. That's a much better thing to do than push your left hand down sort of towards the bottom end of the bass clef where it's suddenly going to sound very growly and murky again. So if we have to move anything, push the right hand up, not the left hand down. So in this situation, one interesting thing we might do as we build the arrangement is to give other members of the band a solo. Because this particular example is fairly concise, there's not a lot of point giving our pre-recorded bass player and drummer solos, but you might do in a real life situation, and in which case your job on the piano then is just to sort of comp lightly. Just to ghost in a little bit of time and harmony so that they can play around that. You can see that actually I started playing some chords in my right hand there as well, just to give me something more interesting to do. But there's no rules really, apart from just giving your bass player or your drummer, whichever's taking a solo, the space to do what they're going to do, so you can support them but without getting in their way. Another fun thing to do though is fours, and this is where one player improvises for 4 bars, Then the other player bounces 4 bars back at them and they ping pong. Now that can go on for a whole chorus, 2 choruses if you really want. In the arrangement that we've made for Autumn Leaves here, and on the backing track that I've done an arrangement that looks like this. Once round the chorus with the pianist playing the melody and comping conventionally. The second chorus, the piano is going to take a full solo all the way through. In the third chorus, it's 4s with the bass player for the first half. So the bass player plays a 4-bar little phrase, you answer them again, the bass player plays another 4-bar phrase, you answer them again. That could carry on, but in our version I've then defaulted to the piano taking the full solo for the rest of the chorus through to the end, and then the 4th chorus of the whole tune, because we're going to play it all the way through 4 times, the 4th chorus is going to be back to piano playing the melody. And typically you might choose to embellish that last version much more than you did the first time. So the first time we hear it, it might be a little bit more recognisable. The last time you could go off piste a bit more if you chose to. The final thing I've done on this is a little typical repeat ending where we use the last 4 bars, and instead of just stopping, we're going to get to the end and roll the last 4 bars round twice more, a little bit of a slowdown at the end, and maybe a little piano flourish to finish it. So that's our arrangement. 4 times through, first time is piano melody, second time through is piano solo, third time through is 4s for the first half, piano solo the second half, and last time through is piano taking the melody back again. I hope all that makes sense. Let's demo the tune now.